the unfindable was the most catastrophic mistake of his worthless life. Before I tell you how my own son learned that leaving your mother stranded in the middle of nowhere can land you in federal custody, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story of betrayal and digital justice resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, I have another incredible story of family revenge that will absolutely blow your mind. My name is Catherine Cat Morrison. I'm 72 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my son Daniel, a man I'd sacrificed everything to raise and support, thought he could abandon me at a gas station in the middle of rural Montana like I was nothing more than unwanted baggage, only to discover that the frail elderly woman he saw as disposable was actually a retired senior digital forensics specialist who had spent over 3 decades hunting down cybercriminals, identity thieves, and people who believed they could disappear. You see, when people look at me today, they see exactly what Daniel saw: a 72-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing sensible shoes from Walmart and cardigans from Target, someone who asks for help at the grocery store self-checkout and still writes checks at the pharmacy. They see someone who represents the past rather than the future, someone who was probably left behind when the world went digital, someone who might know how to use email but certainly couldn't navigate the complex world of modern technology that defines our daily lives. Daniel had been seeing me this way for years, watching me struggle with my smartphone, getting frustrated when I couldn't figure out how to stream movies on his fancy TV, rolling his eyes when I asked him to help me update my computer or explain why my Wi-Fi wasn't working. In his mind, I was just another elderly person who had been overwhelmed by technological progress, someone who needed constant help and guidance to function in a world that had moved beyond my understanding. What Daniel didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 37 years of being my son, was that the woman he saw as technologically helpless had actually been on the cutting edge of digital investigation since before the internet even existed. While he was learning to walk, I was learning to trace electronic communications through primitive computer networks that most people didn't even know existed. While he was playing video games in elementary school, I was developing techniques for tracking digital footprints that would later become standard procedures for law enforcement agencies worldwide. The irony was so complete, it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Daniel thought I was struggling with technology because I was old and confused, when the reality was that I understood technology at a level that would make most IT professionals feel inadequate. I knew how to trace digital communications through multiple proxy servers, how to recover data from supposedly wiped hard drives, how to track cryptocurrency transactions through blockchain networks, and how to build comprehensive digital profiles of people who thought they had covered their tracks completely. But I had learned early in my career that sometimes the most effective tool an investigator can have is being underestimated by the people they're investigating. Criminals become careless when they believe they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand their methods or capabilities. They reveal information they would never share if they knew they were talking to someone who could use that information to destroy them. So I had become very good at playing the role of the confused elderly woman when it served my purposes. I would act frustrated with technology, ask for help with simple tasks, and let people believe I was helpless when it came to anything more complex than basic phone calls and email. This performance wasn't just useful for professional investigations. It had become a valuable way to observe people's true character when they thought I couldn't possibly pose a threat to them. Daniel had failed this character test spectacularly. Instead of treating my apparent technological limitations with patience and kindness, he had become increasingly dismissive and condescending over the years. Instead of appreciating the opportunity to help someone he claimed to love, he had begun to see my requests for assistance as burdens that interfered with his own priorities and schedule. More troubling, Daniel had begun to talk about me as if I were a problem to be managed, rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. He would make comments about how exhausting it was to explain technology to me, how frustrating it was that I couldn't keep up with modern conveniences, and how much easier his life would be if I could just figure things out for myself. These comments revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both technology and family relationships. Daniel assumed that technological proficiency was simply a matter of intelligence and effort, and that my struggles indicated some kind of personal failing rather than a deliberate performance designed to gather information about his character. He never considered that someone might choose to appear helpless for strategic reasons, or that there might be more to my relationship with technology than what he observed during our limited interactions. But Daniel's condescending attitude toward my apparent technological limitations was just one symptom of a much larger problem with his character development. Over the past decade, I had watched my son transform from a loving, considerate young man into someone who seemed to view other people primarily in terms of what they could do for him or how they might interfere with his plans. This transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process that began around the time Daniel started his career in sales and became obsessed with projecting an image of success and independence that he hadn't actually earned. He had developed an inflated sense of his own importance and capabilities, combined with an impatience for anyone or anything that didn't contribute directly to his goals and self-image. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, a position that required him to travel extensively throughout the northwestern United States. His territory included Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and parts of North and South Dakota, remote areas where he would spend weeks at a time visiting hospitals, clinics, and medical practices to demonstrate and sell expensive diagnostic equipment. The travel requirements of Daniel's job had initially seemed like a positive development. He enjoyed the independence and responsibility of managing his own schedule and territory. He took pride in his ability to navigate unfamiliar cities, build relationships with medical professionals, and close deals that required sophisticated understanding of complex equipment and healthcare systems. But over time, the constant travel and the pressure to meet aggressive sales targets had begun to change Daniel's personality in ways that were increasingly concerning. He had become impatient with anything that didn't directly contribute to his professional success. He viewed personal relationships as either assets that could help his career or liabilities that might interfere with his goals. Family obligations, in particular, had begun to feel like obstacles to Daniel rather than opportunities for connection and mutual support. When I needed help with household repairs, transportation to medical appointments, or assistance with technology, Daniel would respond as if I were deliberately trying to sabotage his schedule rather than simply asking for reasonable support from my son. "Mom, I don't have time for this right now," had become Daniel's standard response to most requests for help. "I'm in the middle of a major sales cycle, and I can't afford to get distracted by non-essential issues." The phrase non-essential issues was particularly hurtful because it revealed how Daniel had come to categorize our relationship. In his mind, my needs and concerns were peripheral to the really important business of his career advancement. I had become a source of interruptions rather than a person whose welfare should matter to him, regardless of his professional obligations. This attitude had become especially problematic during the past 2 years, as Daniel's sales territory had expanded and his travel schedule had become even more demanding. He was spending 3 weeks out of every month on the road, visiting clients and prospects across a region that covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. The extensive travel had also affected Daniel's personal life in ways that seemed to reinforce his selfish and impatient tendencies. He had ended a 3-year relationship with a lovely woman named Sarah Chen, a nurse practitioner who had been genuinely caring and supportive, because he claimed that maintaining a serious relationship was incompatible with his current career trajectory. Quote, "When I had gently suggested that Sarah seemed to understand his travel schedule and was willing to accommodate the demands of his job, Daniel had responded with a dismissive explanation that revealed how completely his priorities had shifted toward self-interest. "Mom, you don't understand how competitive my industry is," Daniel had explained with the condescending tone he had begun using whenever I questioned his decisions. "I need to be completely focused on building my client base and expanding my territory. I can't afford to have emotional complications that might distract me from my goals." The fact that Daniel viewed a loving relationship as an emotional complication was deeply troubling, but even more concerning was his apparent belief that success required abandoning all personal connections and obligations that might require time, energy, or emotional investment on his part. This philosophy had gradually extended to his relationship with me as well. Over the past year, Daniel had become increasingly resentful about any requests for help or support. as if my needs were deliberate attempts to interfere with his career, rather than the normal expectations of family relationships. When my car had needed major repairs 6 months earlier, Daniel had responded to my request for advice and assistance, as if I were trying to sabotage his quarterly sales numbers. When I had asked him to accompany me to a medical appointment for moral support, he had acted as if I were being deliberately manipulative and unreasonable. "Mom, I love you, but you need to understand that I can't drop everything every time you have some kind of crisis," Daniel had said during one particularly tense conversation. "You're going to have to figure out how to handle these things independently, because my job requires me to be available for my clients, not constantly dealing with family emergencies." The irony of this attitude was that most of my requests for help weren't emergencies at all. They were routine aspects of family relationships that required minimal time and effort, but provided opportunities for connection and mutual support. Daniel had reframed these normal interactions as unreasonable demands, because acknowledging them as reasonable would have required him to admit that his career obsession was causing him to neglect his basic obligations to the people who loved him. But Daniel's selfish attitude toward family relationships was just one manifestation of a broader character problem that had been developing over several years. He had become someone who viewed all of his relationships in transactional terms, evaluating people based on what they could provide for him rather than what he might contribute to their lives. This transactional approach to relationships had become particularly evident in Daniel's attitude toward money and financial obligations. Despite earning a substantial income from his sales job, his base salary was $85,000 annually, plus commissions that typically added another $40,000 to $60,000 per year. Daniel had developed spending habits that consistently left him feeling financially pressured and resentful about any expenses that didn't directly benefit him. Daniel lived in a luxury apartment in Billings, Montana that cost $2,800 per month, far more than necessary for someone who was traveling 3 weeks out of every month. He drove a leased BMW X5 that cost $750 monthly, ostensibly because he needed a reliable vehicle for his extensive travel, but actually because he wanted to project an image of success when meeting with medical professionals. His wardrobe consisted primarily of expensive suits and accessories that he claimed were necessary for his professional image, but that actually reflected his personal obsession with appearing successful and important. Daniel would spend $300 on a single dress shirt, not because cheaper alternatives were inadequate for his job requirements, but because he enjoyed the feeling of superiority that came from wearing luxury brands. But perhaps most revealing of Daniel's character problems were his attitudes toward gift-giving and financial generosity within family relationships. Despite his substantial income and expensive lifestyle, Daniel had become increasingly stingy about spending money on anyone other than himself. For my birthday last year, Daniel had given me a $25 gift card to Target, presenting it as if he were being generous, rather than acknowledging that he had spent less on my birthday than he routinely spent on a single lunch during his business travel. When I had thanked him politely for the gift, he had made a comment about how expensive it was becoming to maintain relationships with people who, quote, always seemed to need something, quote. The contrast between Daniel's spending on himself and his spending on family relationships revealed exactly how he had come to prioritize his own comfort and image over basic decency and consideration for others. He could justify spending $750 monthly on a car payment, but he resented spending $25 on his mother's birthday present. This pattern had become even more problematic during family gatherings and holidays, where Daniel's financial selfishness created uncomfortable dynamics with other family members who maintained more reasonable approaches to generosity and mutual support. During Christmas gatherings with my sister Eleanor's family, Daniel's gifts were consistently the least thoughtful and least expensive, despite his being the highest earner among the cousins. While Eleanor's children would give meaningful presents that reflected genuine consideration for the recipients, Daniel would typically bring generic gift cards or household items that seemed more like obligation fulfillment than expressions of love or appreciation. But Daniel's financial selfishness was just one aspect of a broader pattern of entitlement that had been developing throughout his adult life. He had begun to act as if the world owed him success, recognition, and convenience, and as if other people's needs and preferences were obstacles to his personal satisfaction rather than legitimate considerations that deserved respect and accommodation. This entitlement was particularly evident in Daniel's travel behavior and his treatment of service workers, retail employees, and anyone else whose job involved helping customers or clients. I had witnessed him being rude to restaurant servers, dismissive toward hotel staff, and condescending toward store clerks who couldn't immediately solve his problems or provide exactly what he wanted. "Do you understand who I am?" had become Daniel's standard response when anyone failed to provide the level of service he believed he deserved. "I'm a regional sales manager for a major medical equipment company, and I travel extensively for business. I expect to be treated with the respect that my position warrants." The fact that Daniel thought his job title entitled him to special treatment from people who were simply trying to do their jobs revealed how completely his sense of perspective had been distorted by his career success and financial income. He had forgotten that respect was something you earned through character and behavior, not something you demanded based on professional titles or economic status. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Daniel's character development was his increasing tendency to view other people's problems and limitations as personal inconveniences, rather than opportunities for compassion and assistance. When friends or family members faced difficulties, Daniel's first instinct was to evaluate how their problems might affect him rather than considering how he might be able to help. This self-centered approach to relationships had become especially problematic in his interactions with me as I had grown older and occasionally needed more support with transportation, household maintenance, and technology. Instead of viewing these needs as normal aspects of family relationships that provided opportunities for connection and mutual care, Daniel had begun to treat my requests for help as unreasonable demands that interfered with his personal priorities. The transportation issue had become particularly contentious over the past year. My vision had deteriorated somewhat, making night driving more challenging, and I had begun asking Daniel for rides to evening events or medical appointments that were scheduled after dark. These requests were reasonable and infrequent, perhaps once or twice per month, but Daniel had begun responding as if I were asking him to completely reorganize his life around my schedule. "Mom, you're going to have to figure out alternative transportation," Daniel had told me during our most recent conversation about this issue. "I can't be your personal chauffeur every time you need to go somewhere. Maybe it's time to start thinking about moving to a retirement community where these kinds of services are provided." The suggestion that I should move to a retirement community because I occasionally needed transportation assistance revealed how completely Daniel had misunderstood both my actual needs and my capabilities. I was in excellent health for someone my age, mentally sharp, and perfectly capable of managing my own life with minimal support. The transportation requests weren't evidence of declining independence. They were simply practical accommodations for minor vision changes that were completely normal for someone in their 70s. But Daniel's suggestion about retirement communities wasn't really about my practical needs. It was about his desire to eliminate any responsibilities or obligations that might interfere with his self-centered lifestyle. If I lived in a facility where professional staff handled my occasional support needs, Daniel could maintain the illusion of being a caring son without actually having to invest time or effort in our relationship. This attitude toward family obligations was part of a broader pattern where Daniel had begun to view all of his personal relationships as either assets or liabilities, rather than sources of meaning and connection that required ongoing investment and attention. Friends who could provide business contacts or career opportunities were valuable and worth maintaining. Family members who occasionally needed support or assistance were burdens that interfered with his goals and priorities. The most devastating aspect of Daniel's character transformation was that he seemed completely unaware of how his behavior affected other people, or how his priorities had shifted away from basic human decency toward pure self-interest. He genuinely believed that his career success justified his selfish behavior, and that other people's needs were unreasonable obstacles to his personal satisfaction. This lack of self-awareness had made it impossible to have meaningful conversations with Daniel about his attitude and behavior. When I had tried to discuss my concerns about his increasing selfishness and lack of consideration for others, he had responded defensively, suggesting that I was being overly sensitive, or that I didn't understand the pressures of his professional responsibilities. "Mom, I think you're taking things too personally," Daniel had said during our last serious conversation about his behavior. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but I have to prioritize my career right now because this is a critical time for my professional development. Once I get established in my territory and build my client base, I'll have more time for family obligations." But Daniel had been making similar promises about future availability for over 3 years, and his behavior had only become more selfish and dismissive over time. The critical time for his professional development seemed to be a permanent condition that justified indefinite neglect of his personal relationships and family obligations. This was the background that led to the events of that October morning, when Daniel's character problems finally resulted in consequences he couldn't ignore or rationalize away. For months, he had been treating me as an inconvenience and a burden, someone whose needs interfered with his priorities, and whose feelings were less important than his convenience. But what Daniel didn't understand was that the elderly woman he saw as helpless and disposable was actually someone who had built her entire career around ensuring that people who hurt others faced appropriate consequences for their actions. And this time, those consequences were going to be very, very personal. The gas station where Daniel abandoned me wasn't just the location of his worst mistake. It was going to become the starting point for a digital investigation that would expose every aspect of his selfish, entitled lifestyle and demonstrate to him exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who had spent 35 years tracking down people who thought they could escape justice. Daniel thought he was abandoning a confused old woman who would eventually find her way home and forgive his cruelty, because that's what mothers are supposed to do. What he actually did was declare war on someone who had dedicated her professional life to making sure that people who prey on the vulnerable faced consequences they would never forget. And I was about to show my son exactly what those consequences looked like when delivered by someone who understood technology, investigation, and justice at a level he couldn't even begin to comprehend. To understand how completely Daniel misjudged the woman he chose to abandon at that remote gas station, you need to understand who Catherine Morrison really was beneath the grandmother facade that had fooled him so thoroughly. Because the story of how my son ended up facing federal charges begins with understanding that I wasn't just another elderly woman struggling with modern technology. I was someone who had helped create the very digital forensics techniques that law enforcement agencies worldwide now use to track down cybercriminals. My journey into digital forensics began in 1987, when I was 25 years old and the internet as we know it today didn't even exist. I had just graduated from Montana State University with a degree in computer science, one of only 3 women in my graduating class, and I was working as a systems analyst for the Montana Department of Revenue when everything changed because of a case of electronic fraud that would redirect the entire course of my life. The department had been experiencing mysterious discrepancies in their tax processing system for several months. Refund checks were being issued for amounts that didn't match the original tax returns, electronic payments were disappearing from accounts without proper documentation, and the computerized filing system was showing irregularities that no one could explain using conventional auditing methods. At the time, most people in government and law enforcement had very limited understanding of how computer systems could be manipulated or compromised. The idea that someone could commit crimes using electronic methods was still largely theoretical, and there were no established procedures for investigating digital fraud or recovering electronic evidence. But I had grown up fascinated by computers and programming, spending countless hours learning about how electronic systems worked and how data moved through networks that most people couldn't even see. While my colleagues viewed computers as sophisticated calculators that could process information faster than human workers, I understood that they were actually complex systems that could be programmed to do almost anything, including things that their original designers had never intended. When I started investigating the Revenue Department's electronic irregularities, I quickly realized that what we were dealing with wasn't simple human error or mechanical malfunction. Someone had deliberately programmed unauthorized modifications into the tax processing system, creating pathways for money to be redirected without triggering the normal security alerts that should have detected unusual transactions. The sophistication of the fraud was remarkable for its time. The perpetrator had created what we would now call a logic bomb, a piece of code that would execute specific commands when certain conditions were met, allowing them to steal money from the state's tax refund system in amounts that were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to accumulate into substantial theft over time. More impressively, the person responsible had created multiple layers of electronic misdirection that made it extremely difficult to trace the stolen money to its final destination. They were using primitive versions of techniques that would later become standard methods for money laundering and identity theft, routing transactions through multiple accounts, creating false electronic trails, and using timing delays that made it nearly impossible to connect the theft to any specific person or transaction. What made this case particularly challenging was that conventional law enforcement had no experience with electronic crimes and no established procedures for investigating fraud that existed entirely in digital form. The state police investigators who were assigned to the case kept looking for physical evidence, documents, witnesses, traditional financial records that simply didn't exist because the entire crime had been committed using electronic methods. That's when I volunteered to apply my computer science background to help solve what everyone else seemed to consider an impossible case. Working nights and weekends while maintaining my regular duties at the Revenue Department, I began developing techniques for tracking electronic transactions, recovering deleted data, and analyzing computer code to understand how the fraudulent system had been created and implemented. The investigation took me 6 months of intensive work, during which I essentially taught myself the fundamentals of what would later become known as digital forensics. I learned how to examine computer memory for traces of unauthorized programs, how to recover data from supposedly erased storage devices, and how to trace electronic communications through primitive network systems that most people didn't even know existed. But perhaps most importantly, I learned to think like someone who was using technology to commit crimes. I studied the methods the perpetrator had used, not just to solve this particular case, but to understand the broader principles that could be applied to investigating other electronic crimes that were sure to become more common as technology became more widespread. The breakthrough came when I realized that the person responsible for the fraud had made a critical mistake in their programming. They had included a timestamp function in their unauthorized code that was supposed to help them track their own transactions, but which actually created an electronic trail that led directly back to their identity. By analyzing the timestamp patterns and cross-referencing them with employee access records, I was able to determine that the fraud was being committed by Robert Kellerman, a senior programmer in the Revenue Department, who had been with the state for over 8 years and was considered one of their most trusted and reliable employees. Robert had been stealing approximately $4,000 per month for over 2 years, using his legitimate access to the tax processing system to modify the code in ways that redirected refund money to accounts he controlled. The total theft was over $90,000, a substantial amount for any organization, but particularly devastating for a state agency that was already operating under tight budget constraints. When we finally arrested Robert, he was completely shocked that his electronic crimes had been detected and traced back to him. He had assumed that the sophistication of his methods and the electronic nature of his fraud made it impossible for conventional law enforcement to catch him. "How did you figure it out?" Robert asked me during his interrogation, genuinely confused about how his seemingly perfect electronic crime had been solved. "I thought computer fraud was untraceable." That question revealed exactly why I knew that digital forensics was going to become one of the most important areas of law enforcement in the coming decades. Criminals were already beginning to use technology to commit increasingly sophisticated crimes, but law enforcement agencies had virtually no capability for investigating electronic evidence or tracking digital crimes. The Robert Kellerman case became a landmark prosecution that established many of the legal precedents for how electronic evidence could be collected, analyzed, and presented in court. But more importantly for my career, it demonstrated that I had natural talent for understanding how criminals use technology and how their electronic crimes could be detected and prosecuted. Within 6 months of Robert's conviction, I received a call from Special Agent Linda Rodriguez of the FBI's newly formed Computer Crime Unit. Agent Rodriguez had heard about my work on the Montana revenue case and was recruiting specialists who could help the Bureau develop capabilities for investigating the growing number of crimes that involved computers and electronic communications. "Ms. Morrison," Agent Rodriguez said during our first conversation, "you've done something that most law enforcement professionals thought was impossible. You've successfully investigated and solved a complex electronic crime using techniques that don't exist in any training manual. We need people with your skills to help us understand what's coming. What was coming, as Agent Rodriguez explained, was a revolution in criminal activity that would make electronic crimes increasingly common and increasingly sophisticated. The FBI was already seeing cases involving computer intrusions, electronic fraud, and digital theft that were beyond the capabilities of traditional law enforcement methods. The Bureau was looking for people who could help them develop new techniques for investigating electronic crimes, new procedures for collecting and analyzing digital evidence, and new training programs that would prepare law enforcement officers for the technological challenges they would face in the coming decades. The opportunity was exactly what I had been hoping for without even realizing it. Working for the FBI would allow me to focus entirely on digital forensics and electronic crime investigation, developing expertise that would be increasingly valuable as technology became more central to both legitimate activities and criminal enterprises. But joining the FBI also meant leaving Montana, where I had lived my entire life, and moving to Quantico, Virginia for training and initial assignment. It meant committing to a career that would be demanding, sometimes dangerous, and certainly different from anything I had originally planned when I studied computer science in college. Most significantly, it meant accepting that I would be working in a field that was constantly changing and evolving, where the techniques I learned this year might be obsolete next year, because criminals were developing new methods faster than law enforcement could adapt to them. But I was young, ambitious, and fascinated by the challenge of staying ahead of people who were using technology for illegal purposes. The FBI training program was intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from basic law enforcement procedures to advanced techniques for analyzing electronic evidence and testifying in court about technical matters that most judges and juries had never encountered. The program also included extensive training in undercover work and surveillance techniques that were specifically adapted for investigating electronic crimes. I learned how to assume false identities online, how to infiltrate criminal networks that operated through computer bulletin boards and primitive email systems, and how to gather intelligence about criminal activities that existed entirely in digital form. But perhaps the most valuable part of my FBI training was learning to understand the psychology of people who use technology to commit crimes. Electronic criminals had different motivations, different methods, and different vulnerabilities than traditional criminals, and investigating them effectively required understanding how they thought and what mistakes they were likely to make. Most electronic criminals were motivated by intellectual challenge as much as financial gain. They enjoyed the puzzle-solving aspects of breaking into systems and the feeling of superiority that came from outsmarting security measures that were designed to keep them out. This psychological profile made them vulnerable to certain investigative techniques that wouldn't work against more traditional criminals. Electronic criminals also tended to be overconfident about their technical abilities and their understanding of how electronic evidence could be detected and analyzed. They often assumed that deleting files or using encryption would make their crimes untraceable, when in reality these techniques often created additional evidence that could be used to identify and prosecute them. During my early years with the FBI, I worked on cases involving everything from simple computer intrusions to complex international fraud schemes that used emerging internet technologies to steal money from victims around the world. Each case taught me new techniques and helped me develop the expertise that would eventually make me one of the Bureau's most experienced digital forensics specialists. One of my most significant early cases involved a network of criminals who were using bulletin board systems to share stolen credit card information and coordinate identity theft operations across multiple states. The investigation required me to go undercover online, creating false personas and gradually infiltrating their network to understand how they operated and who was involved. The case took 2 years to develop fully, during which I spent countless hours online interacting with criminals who had no idea they were providing evidence that would eventually be used to prosecute them. I learned their methods, documented their transactions, and slowly built comprehensive cases against the entire network of people involved in their identity theft operation. When we finally made arrests, we shut down one of the largest credit card fraud networks that had operated up to that time, recovering over $2 million in stolen money and preventing additional thefts that could have cost victims tens of millions of dollars. But more importantly, the case established procedures and techniques that became standard methods for investigating online criminal networks. The undercover techniques I developed were incorporated into FBI training programs and used by other investigators to infiltrate and prosecute similar criminal organizations. Throughout the 1990s, as the internet became more widely available and electronic commerce began to develop, my work focused increasingly on crimes that involved online fraud, identity theft, and electronic money laundering. I specialized in cases where criminals were using emerging technologies to commit traditional crimes in new ways, and where conventional law enforcement methods were inadequate for investigating electronic evidence. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, but it was also emotionally demanding in ways that I hadn't anticipated when I first joined the Bureau. Electronic crimes often targeted vulnerable victims. Elderly people who were confused by technology, small business owners who didn't understand online security, young people who were naive about internet dangers, and the financial and emotional damage caused by these crimes was often devastating. I investigated cases where elderly victims had lost their life savings to online investment scams, where small businesses had been destroyed by electronic fraud, and where young people had had their identities stolen and their credit destroyed before they were even old enough to understand what had happened to them. Each case reinforced my commitment to ensuring that people who use technology to prey on vulnerable victims faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Electronic criminals often believed that the sophistication of their methods and the digital nature of their crimes made them immune from prosecution, and I took personal satisfaction in proving them wrong. But investigating electronic crimes also required me to stay current, with rapidly evolving technology and constantly changing criminal methods. What I learned in training this year might be obsolete next year, as criminals developed new techniques and law enforcement struggled to keep pace with technological change. This meant that continuing education wasn't just helpful for my career, it was essential for my effectiveness as an investigator. I spent evenings and weekends learning about new technologies, studying emerging criminal techniques, and developing new methods for investigating electronic evidence. I also began teaching and training other law enforcement officers, sharing the techniques I had developed and helping to build the FBI's overall capability for investigating electronic crimes. This training work was particularly rewarding because it multiplied the impact of my expertise, enabling other investigators to solve cases and catch criminals using methods that I had helped to develop. By the early 2000s, I had been promoted to senior digital forensic specialist and was supervising a team of investigators who specialized in different aspects of electronic crime. My responsibilities included not just individual cases, but also developing bureau-wide policies and procedures for collecting and analyzing digital evidence. I was also increasingly involved in international cooperation efforts, working with law enforcement agencies in other countries to investigate crimes that cross national borders, and involved criminals who assumed that international boundaries would protect them from prosecution. These international cases were often the most complex and challenging investigations I worked on, requiring coordination between multiple agencies, navigation of different legal systems, and understanding of cultural and technological differences that affected how crimes were committed and investigated in different countries. But they were also the most satisfying cases when we successfully identified and prosecuted criminals who had assumed that the international nature of their crimes made them untouchable. Electronic criminals often believed that they could operate with impunity by routing their activities through multiple countries and jurisdictions, and proving them wrong required the kind of sophisticated international cooperation that was still being developed during this period. One of my most complex international cases involved a group of criminals who were using servers in 7 different countries to coordinate a sophisticated online fraud scheme that targeted victims in the United States and Canada. The investigation required working with law enforcement agencies in all 7 countries, understanding the legal requirements for evidence collection in each jurisdiction, and coordinating simultaneous arrests across multiple time zones. The case took 3 years to develop fully and resulted in the prosecution of 47 defendants in 5 different countries. More importantly, it demonstrated that international electronic crimes could be successfully investigated and prosecuted, despite the technical and legal challenges involved. Throughout my career, I maintained a philosophy that technology should be used to protect and serve people, not to prey on them or cause them harm. This philosophy motivated my work and helped me maintain perspective during challenging investigations that sometimes involve disturbing crimes and difficult emotional circumstances. I also developed a reputation for being able to explain complex technical matters in ways that judges, juries, and other law enforcement officers could understand and apply. This communication ability was crucial for successful prosecutions, because electronic crimes often involve technical details that were essential for proving guilt, but difficult for non-technical people to comprehend. My testimony in court became a model for how technical experts could present electronic evidence in ways that were both legally sound and accessible to people without specialized knowledge. I testified in over 200 cases during my career, and my testimony was never successfully challenged on technical grounds. But perhaps the most important skill I developed during my 35 years with the Bureau was the ability to think like criminals who use technology to commit crimes. I understood their motivations, their methods, and their psychological vulnerabilities in ways that allowed me to predict their behavior and develop effective strategies for investigating their activities. This psychological insight was particularly valuable when investigating crimes that involved family relationships or personal betrayals, because I understood how people rationalized hurting others and what patterns of behavior indicated when someone was likely to escalate from minor deceptions to serious crimes. When I retired from the FBI in 2022, I had worked on over 800 major cases involving electronic crimes, recovered over $50 million in stolen money, and helped to convict more than 1,500 criminals who had used technology to prey on vulnerable victims. But the statistics that mattered most to me weren't the dollar amounts or conviction numbers. They were the individual victims who had received justice, and the criminals who had learned that electronic crimes weren't as untraceable or unpunishable as they had believed. This extensive experience in tracking down people who thought they were too smart to get caught was exactly why Daniel's decision to abandon me at that gas station was such a catastrophic mistake. He thought he was dealing with a harmless elderly woman who couldn't possibly threaten him or hold him accountable for his cruelty. What he was actually dealing with was someone who had spent 35 years developing expertise in tracking down people who underestimated their victims, who thought they could escape consequences for their actions, and who believed that their methods were too sophisticated for anyone else to understand or counter. The gas station where Daniel left me wasn't just the location of his worst character failure. It was going to become the starting point for a digital investigation that would expose every aspect of his selfish, entitled lifestyle and demonstrate exactly what happened when you targeted someone who had made a career out of ensuring that people faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Daniel had no idea that the confused elderly woman he had abandoned was actually someone who could trace his location through his cell phone data, analyze his financial transactions to understand his spending patterns, and build a comprehensive profile of his activities that would reveal every selfish and illegal thing he had done over the past several years. He thought he was abandoning someone who would eventually find her way home and probably forgive his cruelty, because that's what family members were supposed to do. What he actually did was provide me with the motivation and justification I needed to use every skill I had learned during 35 years of digital forensics to show him exactly what consequences looked like when delivered by someone who understood technology, investigation, and justice at a level he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The elderly woman Daniel saw as helpless and disposable was about to become his worst nightmare, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. To understand the depth of Daniel's betrayal and why his abandonment of me at that gas station was the culmination of years of moral decay rather than a single moment of poor judgment, you need to understand who Daniel Morrison had become by his 37th birthday. Not the loving son I had raised, but a calculating, entitled man whose selfishness had grown so complete that he genuinely believed other people existed primarily to serve his convenience and advance his interests. Daniel Christopher Morrison was born in December 1986, 3 years after I had joined the FBI and begun building what would become a distinguished career in digital forensics. From his first breath, Daniel was the center of my universe, the reason I worked so hard to excel in my profession and the motivation behind every sacrifice I made to ensure he would have opportunities I had never imagined possible. But somewhere along the journey from beloved child to successful adult, Daniel had transformed into someone I barely recognized. Someone whose approach to relationships was so fundamentally selfish that he could abandon his elderly mother at a remote gas station and drive away without experiencing the guilt, shame, or basic human empathy that should have made such cruelty impossible. Understanding how this transformation occurred requires understanding the specific choices Daniel had made over the past 15 years. Choices that had gradually eroded his capacity for genuine love, gratitude, and consideration for anyone whose needs might conflict with his own desires and ambitions. Daniel worked as a regional sales manager for Advanced Medical Technologies, a company that manufactured and distributed sophisticated diagnostic equipment to hospitals, clinics, and medical practices throughout the northwestern United States. His territory covered Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, and parts of Colorado, a region that required extensive travel and provided him with the independence and financial success that had become the foundation of his identity. The position was lucrative and prestigious within the medical equipment industry. Daniel's base salary was $85,000 annually, supplemented by commissions that typically added another $50,000 to $70,000 per year depending on his performance. In a good year, Daniel's total compensation could exceed $150,000, substantial income for someone living in Montana, where the cost of living was significantly lower than in major metropolitan areas. But Daniel's relationship with money revealed the fundamental character flaws that had made his abandonment of me not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Despite earning more money than 90% of Americans, Daniel consistently lived beyond his means, not because his income was inadequate, but because his spending reflected an insatiable need to project an image of success that went far beyond what his actual achievements warranted. Daniel lived in a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown Billings that cost $3,200 per month, nearly 40% of his base salary before taxes. The apartment featured floor-to-ceiling windows, with panoramic views of the Yellowstone River, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and access to building amenities including a fitness center, rooftop deck, and concierge services that Daniel rarely used but enjoyed mentioning to colleagues and potential clients. The apartment was far larger and more expensive than necessary for someone who traveled 3 weeks out of every month, but Daniel had convinced himself that his living situation was an essential component of his professional image. He would invite clients and prospects to his apartment for dinner meetings, using the impressive setting to reinforce his presentation of himself as a successful, sophisticated professional who understood quality and luxury. But the apartment was just one component of Daniel's elaborate and expensive effort to maintain an image that required constant financial input to sustain. His vehicle was a leased BMW X5M competition that cost $890 per month, ostensibly justified by his need for reliable transportation across his extensive territory, but actually chosen because Daniel enjoyed the reactions he received when pulling into hospital parking lots in a vehicle that cost more than most medical residents earned in several months. Daniel's wardrobe was another significant expense that reflected his obsession with projecting success rather than simply meeting professional requirements. He owned 12 custom-tailored suits that cost between $800 and $1,200 each, 30 dress shirts from high-end designers, and shoes that cost more than most people spent on clothing in an entire year. The clothing expenses weren't just about professional requirements. They were about Daniel's psychological need to feel superior to the people around him and to reinforce his belief that he had achieved a level of success that entitled him to luxury and special treatment. Daniel would often mention the brands he wore during casual conversations, not because the information was relevant, but because he enjoyed the reactions from people who recognized the expensive labels. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Daniel's spending patterns was how he allocated his resources between personal luxury and any form of generosity toward others. While Daniel could justify spending $1,500 on a single business dinner to impress a potential client, he would complain about spending $25 on a birthday gift for a family member. This disparity revealed the transactional nature of all Daniel's relationships. Money spent on clients and prospects was an investment in his career advancement and financial success. Money spent on family members or friends provided no comparable return on investment and was therefore viewed as wasteful or unnecessary. Daniel's apartment was filled with expensive electronics, furniture, and artwork that he had purchased to create the impression of sophistication and success. A 75-inch OLED television that cost $8,000, a sound system that cost more than most people's cars, furniture from high-end retailers that emphasized designer names rather than comfort or functionality. But despite all this expensive accumulation, Daniel's apartment felt cold and impersonal, more like a showroom than a home where someone actually lived and found comfort. There were no family photographs, no personal mementos, no evidence that relationships or experiences mattered more to Daniel than the acquisition and display of expensive objects. The lack of personal touches in Daniel's living space reflected a broader pattern, where he had gradually eliminated from his life anything that didn't contribute directly to his professional success or personal comfort. Friends who couldn't provide business contacts or career opportunities had been discarded. Hobbies that didn't offer networking possibilities had been abandoned. Even family relationships had been reduced to cost-benefit analyses, where Daniel's time and attention were allocated based on what he might receive in return. This transactional approach to relationships had become particularly evident in Daniel's romantic life, where a series of relationships had ended when the women involved began expecting emotional investment or commitment that Daniel was unwilling to provide. His most recent relationship had ended 6 months earlier when Rebecca Martinez, a physician assistant at Billings Clinic, had confronted Daniel about his inability to prioritize their relationship over his career ambitions. "Daniel, you treat me like I'm another client you need to manage rather than someone you're supposed to love," Rebecca had told him during their final conversation. "Everything in your life is about your job, your income, your image, and your convenience. There's no room for genuine partnership or emotional intimacy, because you don't want anything that requires you to think about someone else's needs." Daniel's response to Rebecca's concerns had been characteristic of his approach to all relationship conflicts. He had dismissed her feelings as unreasonable expectations that demonstrated her failure to understand his professional obligations and career goals. "Rebecca, you knew from the beginning that my job requires extensive travel and that I'm building something important in my territory," Daniel had replied. "If you can't handle dating someone who has ambitious goals and professional responsibilities, then maybe you should find someone with lower expectations for his career." The fact that Daniel framed Rebecca's desire for emotional connection and mutual consideration as lower expectations revealed how completely his priorities had shifted away from normal human values toward a purely selfish focus on personal advancement and material accumulation. But Daniel's romantic relationships were just one area where his selfishness had become so complete that he couldn't maintain meaningful connections with anyone whose needs might occasionally conflict with his own convenience. His friendships had followed similar patterns, gradually diminishing as Daniel became less willing to invest time or energy in relationships that didn't provide obvious benefits for his career or lifestyle. Daniel's college friendships had largely ended within a few years of graduation, not because of geographic distance or natural drift, but because Daniel had become increasingly impatient with social activities that didn't advance his professional goals. Former classmates who had remained in Montana working in education, social services, or other modestly paid professions had been gradually excluded from Daniel's social circle, as he decided that associating with people who earned less money might damage his image among clients and prospects. The few friendships Daniel had maintained were primarily with other sales professionals who could provide business referrals or industry connections. These relationships were cordial and mutually beneficial, but they lacked the depth and authenticity that characterized genuine friendships, because both parties understood that their association was primarily transactional. Daniel's approach to these professional friendships revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how healthy relationships operated. He would calculate the value he provided to others and the benefits he received in return, becoming resentful when he felt that the exchange wasn't sufficiently advantageous to him. The idea that relationships might have value beyond immediate practical benefits was foreign to Daniel's increasingly narrow worldview. This transactional mindset had also affected Daniel's relationship with his extended family, where he had become the family member who attended gatherings only when convenient, and who contributed minimally to family celebrations, obligations, or mutual support systems that required ongoing investment without guaranteed returns. During family holidays and celebrations, Daniel's behavior had become a source of tension and disappointment among relatives who remembered the thoughtful, generous young man he had once been. He would arrive late to family gatherings because of work obligations that were often simply choices to prioritize his convenience over family commitments. He would leave early for similar reasons, treating family time as an obligation to be minimized rather than an opportunity for connection and mutual support. Daniel's gift-giving at family celebrations had become particularly problematic, not because his family expected expensive presents, but because his choices revealed how little thought or consideration he gave to other people's interests, preferences, or emotional needs. His gifts were typically generic items that could have been purchased for anyone: gift cards, household appliances, or luxury items that reflected Daniel's own preferences rather than any understanding of what the recipients might actually want or appreciate. More troubling than the gifts themselves was Daniel's attitude toward the gift-giving process. He would often mention the cost of his presents, or make comments about how expensive it was becoming to maintain relationships with people who expected gifts on birthdays and holidays. These comments revealed that Daniel viewed generosity toward family members as a burden rather than an expression of love and connection. The contrast between Daniel's spending on himself and his spending on family relationships was stark and revealing. He could justify spending $300 on a business dinner without hesitation, but he would complain about spending $50 on a birthday gift for his cousin. He would buy himself $1,000 shoes while giving his aunt a $20 gift card for Christmas. This pattern extended to Daniel's relationship with me as well, where his contributions to our relationship had become increasingly minimal, while his expectations for my support and assistance had remained constant or even increased. Daniel expected me to be available whenever he needed help with personal matters, professional advice, or emotional support. But he had become increasingly unwilling to reciprocate when I occasionally needed assistance with transportation, household maintenance, or technology problems. The most revealing example of Daniel's selfishness in our relationship had occurred 6 months earlier, when my car had needed major transmission repairs that would cost $2,800. I had asked Daniel for advice about whether to repair the car or replace it, and whether he might be able to help with transportation to medical appointments if I decided to be without a car for a few weeks while saving money for a replacement. Daniel's response had been immediate and revealing. Rather than offering to help with transportation or even discussing the pros and cons of repair versus replacement, he had suggested that I should consider moving to a retirement community where transportation services were provided as part of the monthly fees. "Mom, maybe this is a sign that you should start thinking about simplifying your living situation," Daniel had said during our phone conversation about the car repairs. "There are some really nice senior communities in Billings where you wouldn't need to worry about car maintenance, household repairs, or any of these kinds of problems." The suggestion that I should completely reorganize my life rather than accept a few weeks of temporary transportation assistance revealed how Daniel had come to view any inconvenience to himself as a problem that other people should solve by changing their circumstances, rather than expecting support from family relationships. But Daniel's selfishness wasn't just passive neglect of family obligations. It had become active manipulation designed to minimize his responsibilities while maximizing the benefits he received from relationships. He had developed sophisticated techniques for making other people feel guilty about requesting his help, while simultaneously making himself appear generous and considerate when providing minimal assistance. When I had eventually decided to repair my car and had asked Daniel to drive me to the repair shop and pick me up when the work was completed, he had agreed to help but had spent the entire interaction making comments about how complicated his schedule was and how he was rearranging important meetings to accommodate my needs. The reality was that Daniel's schedule was largely under his own control, and driving me to the repair shop required less than 2 hours of his time on a day when he had no scheduled client meetings. But by emphasizing the inconvenience and sacrifice involved in helping me, Daniel made sure that I felt guilty about asking for assistance and grateful for receiving what should have been normal family support. This pattern of making minimal help seem like major sacrifice had become Daniel's standard approach to family relationships. He would provide assistance when directly asked, but only after making it clear that doing so required significant effort and disrupted his more important priorities. The psychological effect of this approach was to train family members to ask for help less frequently and to feel guilty about having needs that might inconvenience Daniel. Over time, this manipulation had reduced Daniel's family obligations to a minimum, while allowing him to maintain the appearance of being a caring son and family member. But perhaps the most concerning aspect of Daniel's character development was his increasing tendency to view other people's problems and limitations as personal annoyances, rather than opportunities for compassion and assistance. When friends, colleagues, or family members faced difficulties, Daniel's first reaction was always to evaluate how their problems might affect him, rather than considering how he might be able to help. This self-centered response to other people's difficulties had become particularly evident in Daniel's interactions with elderly relatives and family friends, who occasionally needed assistance with technology, transportation, or other age-related challenges. Rather than viewing these needs as normal aspects of aging that provided opportunities for younger family members to demonstrate love and respect, Daniel treated them as irritating interruptions to his schedule and evidence that elderly people were becoming burdens rather than valuable family members. During family gatherings, Daniel's impatience with elderly relatives had become increasingly obvious and uncomfortable for other family members, who maintained more traditional values about respecting and caring for aging family members. He would visibly roll his eyes when older relatives asked for help with their smartphones, make dismissive comments about their confusion with modern technology, and generally treat them as if their limitations were personal failings rather than normal aspects of aging. This attitude toward elderly people was particularly disturbing because it revealed Daniel's complete lack of empathy for the aging process and his inability to imagine himself ever being in a position where he might need assistance or patience from younger family members. In Daniel's worldview, people were either useful or burdensome, and elderly people had largely moved into the burdensome category because their needs required time and energy that didn't advance his personal goals. The irony of Daniel's attitude toward elderly family members was that he himself was beginning to experience some of the physical limitations that naturally accompany aging, but he was completely blind to the parallel between his own minor health issues and the more significant challenges faced by people who were 20 or 30 years older than him. Daniel had developed chronic back problems from his extensive driving, occasional knee pain from old sports injuries, and reading glasses that he was embarrassed to wear in professional settings. When these issues affected his comfort or convenience, he expected understanding and accommodation from others. But when elderly family members experienced similar or more serious age-related challenges, Daniel viewed their needs as unreasonable impositions on his time and patience. This fundamental lack of empathy and self-awareness had made Daniel incapable of understanding how his behavior affected other people, or recognizing that his increasing selfishness was destroying his relationships with family members, who had once loved and supported him unconditionally. The most tragic aspect of Daniel's character transformation was that he seemed completely unaware of what he had lost through his choices. The loving relationships, emotional connections, and sense of belonging that had once been central to his life had been gradually sacrificed in pursuit of professional success and material accumulation that provided no comparable satisfaction or meaning. Daniel's apartment, despite its luxury and expense, was a lonely place where he spent his limited time at home watching television, playing video games, or working on his laptop. He had no hobbies that brought him joy, no friendships that provided emotional support, and no romantic relationship that offered genuine intimacy and partnership. The professional success that Daniel had prioritized above all else was beginning to feel hollow and unsatisfying, not because he wasn't successful, but because success without meaningful relationships and genuine connections felt empty and pointless. But rather than recognizing that his problems stemmed from his own choices and values, Daniel had begun to blame other people for failing to appreciate his achievements and understand his priorities. This was the psychological foundation for Daniel's decision to abandon me at that gas station. In his mind, I had become another elderly person whose needs and limitations were interfering with his schedule and convenience. The fact that I was his mother, that I had sacrificed my own needs throughout his childhood to ensure his success, and that I deserved basic respect and consideration, regardless of my age or limitations, were considerations that no longer carried weight in Daniel's moral calculations. Daniel had convinced himself that my requests for occasional assistance were unreasonable demands that demonstrated my failure to adapt to modern independence rather than normal family obligations that he should fulfill willingly and graciously. He had reframed his selfishness as justified boundary setting and his neglect of family relationships as necessary focus on his career goals. The gas station abandonment wasn't an impulsive moment of anger or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the logical culmination of 15 years of choices that had gradually eroded Daniel's capacity for love, empathy, and basic human decency. He had become someone who could drive away from his elderly mother without experiencing the guilt or shame that should have made such behavior impossible. But what Daniel didn't understand was that his decision to abandon me wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was also a criminal act that would trigger consequences he had never imagined possible. Elder abandonment was a felony in Montana, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and substantial fines. More importantly, abandoning someone with my background and expertise was about to result in consequences that would destroy everything Daniel had spent 15 years building. The successful, sophisticated image that Daniel had worked so hard to create was about to be exposed as a facade covering fundamental character flaws that would horrify everyone who had been fooled by his professional persona. The financial security he had prioritized above all else was about to be threatened by legal costs and criminal penalties that would make his expensive lifestyle impossible to maintain. Most importantly, the family relationships that Daniel had taken for granted while treating them as inconveniences were about to be lost forever when his true character was revealed through actions that could never be forgiven or forgotten. Daniel thought he was abandoning a helpless, elderly woman who would probably find her way home and eventually forgive his cruelty, because that's what mothers were supposed to do. What he actually did was provide someone with 35 years of digital forensics experience, with the motivation and justification needed to use every investigative skill she had learned to ensure that he faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. The remote gas station where Daniel left me wasn't just the location of his worst moral failure. It was going to become the starting point for an investigation that would expose every aspect of his selfish, entitled lifestyle and demonstrate exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who had built her career around making sure that people who hurt others faced justice they would never forget. To understand the full magnitude of Daniel's miscalculation when he abandoned me at that remote gas station, you need to understand the complete truth about who Catherine Morrison really was beneath the modest grandmother facade that had fooled him so thoroughly. Because while Daniel saw a struggling elderly woman who needed his help and patience, the reality was that he had just declared war on someone whose resources, connections, and capabilities were so far beyond his comprehension that his abandonment of me would trigger consequences he never could have imagined possible. The woman Daniel left stranded at that gas station wasn't just a retired federal investigator. She was someone who had accumulated wealth, professional networks, and technological capabilities that made her one of the most dangerous people he could possibly have chosen to betray. But Daniel's complete lack of curiosity about my actual life, combined with his arrogant assumptions about elderly people and technology, had blinded him to the reality of who I was and what I was capable of when someone made the mistake of underestimating me. Let me paint you a picture of the resources that Daniel never bothered to discover, because understanding my true capabilities is essential to comprehending how spectacularly he had misjudged his situation, and why his abandonment of me was about to result in his complete destruction. During my 35-year career with the FBI, I hadn't just been a well-compensated federal employee. I had been one of the Bureau's highest-paid specialists, earning a salary that reflected both my technical expertise and my value to national security operations. My final salary as a senior digital forensics specialist was $168,000 annually, but that base compensation was supplemented by overtime pay for complex cases, bonuses for successful prosecutions, and consulting fees for training programs that often doubled my official income. Over the course of my career, my total annual compensation had averaged nearly $300,000 per year, far more than Daniel earned at the peak of his sales performance, and far more than he had ever imagined possible for someone he viewed as a simple government worker. But the salary itself was only the beginning of my financial accumulation. because my understanding of technology and digital systems had also made me extremely successful at investing and building wealth outside of my government employment. My knowledge of cybersecurity, electronic fraud, and digital financial systems had given me insights into investment opportunities and wealth-building strategies that weren't available to people without my specialized expertise. I understood how electronic trading systems worked, how to identify and avoid investment scams that fooled less technologically sophisticated investors, and how to use technology to monitor and optimize my investment portfolio in ways that consistently outperformed standard market returns. More importantly, my work investigating financial crimes had taught me exactly how wealthy people protected and grew their assets, because I had spent decades analyzing the financial strategies of both legitimate investors and criminal organizations that had accumulated substantial wealth through legal and illegal means. I understood offshore banking, asset protection trusts, cryptocurrency investments, and international financial structures that most people never learned about because they weren't relevant to their modest financial situations. By the time I retired from the FBI in 2022, my investment portfolio was worth just over $8 million, accumulated through careful planning, sophisticated investing, and the kind of financial discipline that Daniel had never learned, because he prioritized immediate gratification over long-term wealth building. But even this substantial portfolio was only part of my total financial resources, because my expertise in digital forensics had also created opportunities for post-retirement income that most people couldn't access. After leaving the Bureau, I had established Morrison Digital Investigations, a consulting firm that provided forensic accounting and cybersecurity services to law firms, insurance companies, and corporations that needed expert analysis of complex financial crimes and electronic fraud cases. My reputation in the field and my extensive network of professional contacts meant that I could charge premium rates for my expertise, and my decades of experience made the work both intellectually satisfying and extremely lucrative. In the 18 months since establishing my consulting practice, Morrison Digital Investigations had generated over $600,000 in revenue, with profit margins that most businesses could only dream of because my overhead costs were minimal and my expertise commanded fees that reflected the specialized nature of my services. The consulting work also kept me connected to the law enforcement and legal communities that had been my professional home for 35 years. I maintained active relationships with FBI agents, federal prosecutors, cybersecurity specialists, and forensic experts who respected my expertise and valued my insights on current cases. These relationships weren't just professional networking, they were friendships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. When I worked on consulting cases, I operated from a home office that Daniel assumed was just a spare bedroom where I kept old paperwork and family photographs. In reality, it was equipped with sophisticated computer systems, secure communication equipment, and access to databases and analytical tools that allowed me to conduct the same kind of financial analysis and digital investigation that had made my government career so successful. My home office contained 3 custom-built computer workstations, each optimized for different aspects of digital forensics work. The primary system was designed for data recovery and analysis, with specialized software for examining electronic evidence, recovering deleted files, and tracing digital communications through complex network systems. The second workstation was configured for financial analysis and cryptocurrency tracking, with access to blockchain analysis tools, financial databases, and trading platforms that allowed me to follow money trails through international financial systems that most law enforcement agencies couldn't effectively monitor. The third system was dedicated to communication security and surveillance, equipped with encrypted communication software, advanced VPN capabilities, and tools for monitoring online activities, while maintaining complete anonymity and operational security. But the computer systems were just the technological foundation for capabilities that extended far beyond what most people understood about modern digital investigation. Through my consulting work and professional contacts, I had access to databases and information sources that weren't available to private individuals or even to most law enforcement agencies at the local and state level. I could trace vehicle locations through GPS and cellular data, analyze credit card transactions to build comprehensive profiles of spending patterns and travel habits, and access communication records that revealed detailed information about relationships, activities, and behavioral patterns. These capabilities were legal when used for legitimate investigative purposes, and they were extremely powerful when applied by someone with my level of expertise and experience. More importantly, my understanding of legal procedures and evidence requirements meant that any investigation I conducted would be performed in ways that ensured the results could be used in criminal prosecutions or civil litigation. I knew how to collect evidence that would be admissible in court, how to document investigative procedures that would withstand legal challenges, and how to present technical information in ways that judges and juries could understand and apply. My professional network also included relationships with private investigators, cybersecurity firms, and legal specialists who could provide additional resources and expertise when needed for complex cases. These relationships had been built over decades of successful collaboration, and they represented a level of professional support that was unavailable to most people who found themselves in conflict with someone who had my background and capabilities. But perhaps the most important resource Daniel never knew about was my understanding of his own digital footprint and electronic activities. Because while Daniel had been treating me as a technological incompetent who needed help with basic smartphone functions, I had actually been monitoring his online activities, financial transactions, and communication patterns for over 2 years, as part of my growing concern about his character development and potential criminal behavior. This monitoring wasn't illegal surveillance. It was the kind of background research that any experienced investigator would conduct when someone's behavior raised concerns about potential fraud, abuse, or other criminal activity. Daniel's increasing selfishness, his financial irresponsibility, and his dismissive treatment of family members had triggered my professional instincts about people who might be capable of more serious crimes. Using techniques I had developed during my FBI career, I had been gradually building a comprehensive digital profile of Daniel's activities, spending patterns, and behavioral indicators that revealed far more about his true character than he realized. I knew about his expensive lifestyle, his credit card debt, his dating history, and his professional performance in ways that would have shocked him if he had understood how much information was available to someone with my expertise. I knew that Daniel's apparent financial success was largely an illusion built on credit and debt rather than actual wealth accumulation. His luxury apartment, expensive car, and designer clothing were financed through loans and credit cards that were consuming nearly 80% of his income, leaving him financially vulnerable and increasingly desperate to maintain an image he couldn't actually afford. I knew that Daniel's professional performance had been declining over the past year, with missed sales targets, client complaints, and territorial conflicts that suggested his career wasn't as secure as he pretended. His expense account showed evidence of lifestyle inflation that was inappropriate for someone in his position, and his travel patterns indicated personal activities that were being charged to his employer inappropriately. Most importantly, I knew that Daniel's online activities included searches and communications that revealed a disturbing pattern of research about elder care, inheritance laws, and financial planning topics that suggested he was calculating the potential value of family members' estates rather than planning for their welfare and support. This digital surveillance had been conducted using legal methods and public information sources, but it had provided me with comprehensive understanding of Daniel's true financial situation, professional vulnerabilities, and personal character flaws that he had successfully hidden from other family members and professional contacts. The irony was that while Daniel saw me as someone who needed help understanding modern technology, I actually knew more about his electronic activities than he remembered himself. Every credit card transaction, every online search, every social media interaction, and every communication pattern was creating a digital trail that told the complete story of who Daniel really was beneath his carefully constructed professional facade. But my knowledge of Daniel's activities extended beyond passive monitoring to active preparation for the possibility that his behavior might escalate to criminal activity that would require intervention. Based on my experience investigating family financial crimes, I understood that Daniel's pattern of selfishness and entitlement often preceded more serious exploitation of vulnerable family members. Over the past 6 months, I had been quietly documenting Daniel's behavior and preparing evidence that could be used to protect myself or other family members if his actions crossed the line from selfishness to criminal exploitation. This preparation included recording our conversations, documenting his financial requests and manipulative behavior, and building comprehensive profiles of his activities that would support criminal or civil actions if they became necessary. I had also been consulting with legal experts about elder abuse laws, abandonment statutes, and financial exploitation regulations that might apply if Daniel's behavior escalated to criminal activity. These consultations had confirmed that many of Daniel's actions were already approaching the threshold for criminal charges, and that any more serious exploitation or abandonment would clearly constitute felony offenses with substantial penalties. The legal research had also revealed that Montana had particularly strong laws protecting elderly victims from family exploitation, with enhanced penalties for crimes committed by family members and provisions for recovering damages that could include attorney fees, punitive damages, and restitution for emotional distress. But perhaps most importantly, my preparation had included coordination with law enforcement contacts who understood that family exploitation of elderly victims was often a gradual process that required intervention before it escalated to more serious crimes. Several FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had worked with me during my career had expressed willingness to provide assistance if Daniel's behavior reached the level of criminal activity. These professional relationships meant that any criminal charges against Daniel would receive attention and resources that were typically unavailable for elder abuse cases involving defendants without substantial financial resources or professional connections. Federal prosecutors who respected my work and understood the importance of deterring family exploitation would ensure that Daniel's case received the kind of aggressive prosecution that would send a clear message about the consequences of targeting elderly family members. My financial resources also meant that I could afford the kind of legal representation and investigative support that would ensure Daniel faced maximum consequences for his crimes. While most elderly victims of family exploitation lacked the resources to pursue comprehensive legal action, I could hire the best attorneys, expert witnesses, and private investigators available to build cases that would result in substantial penalties and complete justice. But beyond the financial and legal resources, my most important advantage was psychological understanding of how people like Daniel thought and what methods would be most effective for ensuring they faced appropriate consequences for their actions. My 35 years of investigating criminals had taught me exactly how to gather evidence, build cases, and present prosecutions in ways that would be both legally successful and personally devastating for defendants who had underestimated their victims. Daniel's abandonment of me at that gas station wasn't just elder abuse. It was also a perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happened when someone with his character flaws chose to target someone with my background and capabilities. Every technique I had learned for investigating criminals could be applied to building a comprehensive case that would expose every aspect of Daniel's selfish, criminal behavior. More importantly, Daniel's crime would provide the legal justification for using investigative methods and resources that had previously been constrained by professional ethics and family relationships. Once Daniel crossed the line into criminal behavior, our relationship changed from mother and son to victim and perpetrator, which meant that all my professional capabilities could be applied without the emotional limitations that had previously protected him from the full scope of my expertise. The gas station where Daniel abandoned me was equipped with multiple security cameras that had recorded his license plate, his physical appearance, and the exact time and circumstances of his criminal act. The location was also isolated enough that there were no alternative explanations for why I might have been left there alone, which meant that Daniel's crime was clearly documented and legally indefensible. But the surveillance footage was just the beginning of the evidence that would be used to prosecute Daniel and destroy his carefully constructed life. My digital forensics expertise would be applied to building a comprehensive case that exposed every aspect of his criminal character and ensured that his punishment would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider exploiting elderly family members. The woman Daniel thought he had abandoned was actually someone who had the resources, expertise, and motivation needed to ensure that his crime would result in consequences more severe than he could possibly imagine. His decision to drive away from that gas station without looking back was the last free choice he would make for a very long time. And I was going to make sure that when Daniel finally understood what he had lost by betraying the woman who had given him everything, the knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life. To understand the devastating depth of Daniel's betrayal when he abandoned me at that remote gas station, You need to understand the 37 years of unwavering love, sacrifice, and support that I had invested in building his life. The history that should have made his cruelty impossible rather than inevitable. Because what made Daniel's abandonment so much more than a single act of selfishness was his complete disregard for everything I had done to create the opportunities, advantages, and foundation that had made his comfortable lifestyle possible in the first place. The story of my relationship with Daniel began in December 1986, when I was 25 years old and already a rising star in the FBI's newly formed Computer Crime Unit. I had been with the Bureau for 3 years, working on cases that were defining the future of digital forensics, and I was completely focused on building a career that I hoped would make a meaningful difference in the world. But when Daniel Christopher Morrison took his first breath at 3:47 a.m. on December 15, 1986, everything changed. In that moment, holding my son for the first time, I made a promise to myself that would shape every decision I made for the next 4 decades. Daniel would have every opportunity, every advantage, and every form of support that I could possibly provide, regardless of what sacrifices that commitment might require from me personally. This wasn't just the usual parental love that most mothers feel for their children. This was a deliberate, calculated decision to prioritize Daniel's welfare above my own needs, desires, and even career ambitions in ways that would prove both transformative and ultimately tragic. Daniel's father, Robert Morrison, had been a fellow computer specialist who worked for a private consulting firm in Virginia. Our relationship had been intense but brief, built more on professional compatibility and physical attraction than on the kind of emotional foundation that could survive the stresses of parenthood and career demands. When I discovered I was pregnant, Robert's response revealed exactly who he was beneath his charming professional exterior. Rather than embracing the opportunity to build a family together, he immediately began calculating how fatherhood would interfere with his career goals and lifestyle preferences. "Catherine, I'm just not ready for this kind of responsibility," Robert had told me during the conversation that would end our relationship forever. "I'm at a critical point in my career, and I can't afford to be distracted by family obligations right now. Maybe in a few years, when I'm more established professionally, but not now." Robert's suggestion that I should terminate the pregnancy or consider adoption so that his career timeline wouldn't be disrupted revealed everything I needed to know about his character and priorities. He was willing to abandon his own child rather than accept responsibility for the consequences of our relationship. When I made it clear that I intended to have the baby and raise him myself, Robert's response was to disappear from our lives completely. He transferred to his company's West Coast office, changed his phone number, and never contacted me again. The last communication I received from him was a certified letter from his attorney formally relinquishing his parental rights and absolving himself of any financial responsibility for Daniel's support. This abandonment was devastating emotionally, but it was also clarifying in terms of what I needed to do to ensure Daniel's future. I would be raising him alone, which meant that every decision about my career, my finances, and my personal life would need to be filtered through the question of what would be best for my son. The first major decision was whether to continue my demanding career with the FBI or to seek more predictable, family-friendly employment that would provide better work-life balance, but fewer opportunities for professional advancement and financial growth. Many single mothers in my situation would have chosen stability over ambition, prioritizing immediate needs over long-term potential. But I chose differently. I decided that the best thing I could do for Daniel was to excel in my FBI career, building the kind of expertise and professional reputation that would provide us with financial security, and create opportunities that wouldn't be available if I settled for safer, more conventional choices. This decision required enormous personal sacrifices that Daniel never knew about, because I was determined that he should never feel responsible for limiting my opportunities or creating burdens that might affect his own development. But the reality of combining single motherhood with a demanding federal law enforcement career meant that almost every aspect of my personal life was subordinated to the dual demands of professional excellence and parental responsibility. During Daniel's infancy and early childhood, I worked cases that required extensive travel, long hours, and intensive focus on complex technical problems that couldn't be solved quickly or easily. But I also needed to provide Daniel with consistent care, emotional support, and the kind of stable home environment that would allow him to thrive despite the challenges of being raised by a single parent. The solution was to create elaborate support systems that allowed me to excel professionally while ensuring that Daniel's needs were always met, even when my work required me to be away from home or focused on cases that demanded my complete attention. I hired the best childcare providers I could find, women who weren't just babysitters but professional caregivers who understood child development and could provide Daniel with educational activities, emotional support, and consistent routines that would supplement my own parenting efforts. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez became Daniel's primary caregiver when he was 6 months old, and she remained part of our family until Daniel started kindergarten. Elena was a former elementary school teacher who had decided to focus on private childcare, so she could provide more individualized attention to the children in her care. Elena understood that Daniel's situation required more than basic childcare services. She needed to create an environment where he could develop socially and intellectually while I was working cases that sometimes required me to be away for days or weeks at a time. The cost of this level of professional childcare was substantial, nearly half of my FBI salary during Daniel's first 5 years, but I considered it an essential investment in his development and my ability to continue building the career that would ultimately provide us with long-term financial security. But the financial cost was manageable compared to the emotional cost of missing so many important moments in Daniel's early development. I missed his first steps because I was testifying in a federal courthouse in Chicago. I missed his first words because I was conducting surveillance on a money laundering operation in Miami. I missed dozens of bedtime stories, morning routines, and everyday interactions that most parents take for granted. Each missed moment was a reminder of the sacrifices required to provide Daniel with opportunities that wouldn't be available if I chose easier paths with lower potential rewards. I was building something larger than immediate comfort or convenience. I was creating a foundation that would allow Daniel to have choices and advantages that most children never received. When Daniel started school, new challenges emerged that required different kinds of sacrifices and creative solutions. I needed to be available for parent-teacher conferences, school events, and the various crises and celebrations that are part of every child's educational experience. But I also needed to continue excelling in my FBI career, which often required travel and unpredictable schedules that didn't align with school calendars and family obligations. The solution was to become extremely strategic about how I managed my professional responsibilities, taking on cases and assignments that would advance my career while minimizing conflicts with Daniel's needs and schedule. This meant turning down some opportunities that would have been beneficial for my professional development, but that would have required extended travel or time commitments that would have interfered with my parenting responsibilities. I also began using my analytical skills to optimize every aspect of our family life, creating systems and routines that would maximize the quality time we spent together while ensuring that Daniel's educational and emotional needs were met consistently. Our evenings became intensive sessions where I would help Daniel with homework, listen to his experiences from school, and provide the kind of focused attention that many children never receive from parents who are distracted by multiple competing priorities. I attended every school event that Daniel wanted me to attend, regardless of professional obligations that might have provided legitimate excuses for absence. When Daniel had a role in his third-grade play, I rearranged a federal prosecution timeline to ensure I could be in the front row. When he played youth soccer, I attended every game and practice that I wasn't traveling for work. But perhaps the most important sacrifice I made during Daniel's childhood was the decision to remain single throughout his formative years. I had several opportunities to develop serious relationships with men who were kind, successful, and genuinely interested in building a life with me and Daniel. The most significant of these relationships was with Detective Mark Sullivan of the Virginia State Police, whom I met while working on a joint task force investigating a multi-state identity theft ring. Mark was intelligent, caring, and wonderful with Daniel, who was 8 years old when Mark and I began dating. For 2 years, Mark was a regular presence in our lives, joining us for family dinners, helping Daniel with school projects, and providing the kind of positive male role model that I knew Daniel needed but couldn't provide myself. Mark was also supportive of my career in ways that were rare among men of his generation. He understood the demands of law enforcement work, respected my expertise, and never suggested that I should compromise my professional ambitions for the sake of our relationship. When Mark proposed marriage during Daniel's 5th grade year, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to create the stable, two-parent family that I had always wanted Daniel to experience. Mark loved Daniel genuinely, and Daniel had grown attached to Mark in ways that suggested he would welcome having a stepfather who could provide additional support and guidance. But I ultimately decided that accepting Mark's proposal would require changes in our family dynamic that might interfere with the close relationship Daniel and I had built during his first 10 years. I was concerned that introducing a stepfather, even one as wonderful as Mark, might dilute the intensity of attention and support that I had been providing Daniel throughout his childhood. The decision to end my relationship with Mark was one of the most difficult choices I ever made, both because I genuinely loved him and because I knew that remaining single meant accepting loneliness and isolation that would continue throughout Daniel's childhood and adolescence. But I believed then, and I still believe now, that Daniel's emotional and psychological development was more important than my personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. I wanted him to feel absolutely secure in my love and commitment, without any concern that he might have to compete for my attention, or wonder whether my priorities might shift if I developed serious relationships with other people. This decision meant that all of my emotional energy and personal time was focused on Daniel's development and our relationship, creating a level of intensity and closeness that was both beneficial and, perhaps, ultimately harmful to his character development. Because while my complete focus on Daniel's needs ensured that he felt loved and supported, it also meant that he never learned to consider other people's needs or to appreciate the sacrifices that were being made for his benefit. In my effort to protect Daniel from any sense of burden or responsibility, I may have inadvertently taught him that other people's needs were less important than his own comfort and convenience. During Daniel's middle school and high school years, I continued making major life decisions based primarily on what would be best for his development and opportunities. When I was offered a promotion that would have required us to relocate to Washington, D.C., I declined because Daniel was thriving in his Montana school and had developed friendships that I didn't want to disrupt. When I was invited to join a prestigious joint task force that would have advanced my career significantly but required extensive travel, I negotiated a modified assignment that would allow me to remain based in Montana and maintain more predictable schedules that wouldn't interfere with Daniel's activities and needs. These professional decisions cost me opportunities and advancement that would have been beneficial for my long-term career development, but they ensured that Daniel's high school experience was stable and supportive in ways that allowed him to excel academically and develop the confidence that would serve him well in college and beyond. I also made substantial financial investments in Daniel's education and extracurricular activities that required careful budgeting and significant sacrifices in my own lifestyle and preferences. When Daniel expressed interest in computer programming during his sophomore year, I hired private tutors and paid for advanced courses that weren't available through his school. When he wanted to participate in a summer academic program at Stanford University that cost $8,000, I worked extra consulting assignments and took on additional responsibilities that generated the income needed to pay for the program without touching the college savings I had been building since his birth. When Daniel needed a car during his senior year, not because transportation wasn't available, but because having his own vehicle would provide independence and social advantages that were important to his teenage development, I purchased a reliable used Honda that cost $12,000. Money that came from my personal savings, rather than from funds that had been designated for his college education. Each of these financial decisions required me to live more modestly than my income would have allowed if I had been focused primarily on my own comfort and preferences. While my FBI colleagues were buying luxury cars and expensive homes, I was driving older vehicles and living in a modest house because every discretionary dollar was being invested in Daniel's present and future needs. The college selection and financing process represented the culmination of 18 years of planning and sacrifice, designed to ensure that Daniel would have educational opportunities that would set him up for lifelong success. I had been saving money for his college education since he was born, building a fund that would allow him to attend whatever university he chose without accumulating the student loan debt that burdened so many of his peers. But beyond the financial preparation, I had also been helping Daniel develop the academic credentials extracurricular achievements, and personal qualities that would make him competitive for admission to elite universities. This meant supporting his interests, facilitating his activities, and providing the kind of comprehensive guidance that would maximize his potential for academic and personal success. When Daniel was accepted to the University of Colorado with partial scholarships that would cover about 60% of his costs, I was proud of his achievements and grateful that the financial planning I had done would make it possible for him to graduate without debt. The remaining college costs, approximately $30,000 per year for 4 years, represented a substantial financial commitment that required me to continue living modestly and working additional consulting assignments to generate the income needed to support his education without compromising my own retirement security. But I made these sacrifices gladly because I believed that Daniel's education was the most important investment I could make in his future and in the relationship we would have once he became an independent adult who understood and appreciated everything I had done to create his opportunities. During Daniel's college years, our relationship continued to be close and affectionate in ways that suggested my sacrifices had been worthwhile. He called regularly to share his experiences, asked for advice about academic and personal decisions, and expressed gratitude for the support I was providing that allowed him to focus on his studies without financial stress. When Daniel graduated with a degree in business administration and immediately found a good position with advanced medical technologies, I felt vindicated in all the choices I had made to prioritize his development over my own immediate needs and preferences. Daniel seemed to have developed into exactly the kind of person I had hoped he would become: intelligent, capable, professionally successful, and grateful for the opportunities that had been provided to him. His early career success suggested that the investments I had made in his education and development would pay dividends in the form of a lifelong relationship built on mutual respect and appreciation. But somewhere during Daniel's mid-20s, subtle changes began to appear in his attitude and behavior that initially concerned me but that I tried to dismiss as normal aspects of young adult development and adjustment to professional responsibilities. Daniel's expressions of gratitude became less frequent and less specific, transitioning from detailed appreciation for particular forms of support to generic acknowledgments that seemed more like social obligations than genuine recognition of ongoing assistance. His requests for advice became less common, not because he needed less guidance, but because he had begun to assume that he understood complex adult situations better than someone from my generation could possibly comprehend. Most troubling, Daniel began to express mild irritation when I offered help or support that he hadn't specifically requested, as if my continued involvement in his life was becoming an inconvenience rather than a welcome expression of love and interest. These changes were gradual and subtle enough that I initially attributed them to normal development of independence and confidence that naturally occurred as young adults established themselves professionally and personally. I didn't want to be an overly involved parent who interfered with Daniel's growth into full adulthood. But over time, it became clear that Daniel's changing attitude reflected more fundamental shifts in his values and priorities than normal maturation processes. He had begun to take for granted the support and advantages I had provided, treating them as entitlements, rather than gifts that deserved ongoing appreciation and consideration. More concerning, Daniel had begun to view my occasional needs for assistance or support as unreasonable impositions that interfered with his personal convenience, rather than normal aspects of family relationships that provided opportunities for mutual care and connection. The transportation assistance I needed after my vision changes, the technology help that was part of my deliberate performance of confusion, and the occasional requests for companionship during medical appointments were all reasonable needs that should have been easy for Daniel to meet given his income and flexibility. But Daniel's responses to these requests revealed that he had developed a fundamentally selfish approach to relationships where other people's needs were evaluated primarily in terms of how they affected his schedule and priorities, rather than as opportunities to demonstrate love and maintain family connections. This gradual transformation from grateful son to self-centered adult was heartbreaking to witness, particularly because it seemed to represent a complete rejection of the values I had tried to instill throughout his childhood and education. The sacrifices I had made to ensure Daniel's success had been motivated by love and the hope that providing him with opportunities would enable him to become someone who understood the importance of generosity, compassion, and mutual support in relationships. Instead, those same sacrifices seemed to have taught Daniel that other people's needs were less important than his own comfort, and that the advantages he had received were simply the natural order of things, rather than the result of specific choices and ongoing support that deserved acknowledgement and reciprocation. The gas station abandonment wasn't just a single act of cruelty. It was the culmination of a decade-long process where Daniel had gradually lost the capacity for gratitude, empathy, and basic consideration for the person who had made his entire life possible. But what Daniel didn't understand was that his abandonment of me wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was also a fundamental rejection of 37 years of love and sacrifice that would trigger consequences more severe than he could possibly comprehend. The woman he left at that gas station wasn't just his mother. She was someone who had given up romantic relationships, career opportunities, and personal preferences to ensure his success, and who now had the resources, expertise, and motivation needed to make sure he understood exactly what he had lost through his selfishness and cruelty. Daniel thought he was abandoning someone who would probably forgive his behavior because that's what mothers were supposed to do. What he actually did was provide someone who had spent 37 years loving him unconditionally, with definitive proof that he was incapable of appreciating that love or deserving the continued sacrifices it had required. And I was going to make sure that when Daniel finally realized what he had thrown away, he would have the rest of his life to regret choosing his convenience over the love of the person who had given him everything. The morning of October 15, 2023, started like any other Sunday, with no indication that by evening my son would be in federal custody and his entire life would be destroyed by consequences he never saw coming. But every detail of what happened that day, from Daniel's calculated deception to his moment of ultimate betrayal to the swift and devastating justice that followed, needs to be understood completely, because this wasn't just a story about elder abandonment. This was a masterclass in what happens when someone fundamentally underestimates their victim and discovers too late that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. The day began with a phone call from Daniel at 9:30 a.m., which immediately struck me as unusual because Daniel rarely called on weekends unless he needed something specific or was trying to manage some kind of crisis that required my help or advice. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said, his voice carrying the artificially cheerful tone he used when he wanted something, but was trying to appear casual about it. "I hope I'm not waking you up, but I wanted to see if you might be interested in taking a little road trip with me today." The invitation itself was suspicious because Daniel hadn't suggested spending voluntary time together in over 6 months, and he had never expressed interest in road trips or recreational activities that would require him to be in a car with me for extended periods. "That sounds lovely, Daniel," I replied, immediately activating the recording equipment that I had been using to document our conversations for the past year. "Where were you thinking of going?" "Well, I have to drive out to Miles City for a client meeting tomorrow morning," Daniel explained, referring to a town about 150 miles east of Billings. "I thought maybe you'd enjoy seeing some of the countryside, and we could have lunch at that little cafe you used to like when I was a kid." The mention of the cafe was clearly calculated to appeal to my nostalgia and make the invitation seem like a thoughtful gesture, rather than whatever Daniel was actually planning. But there were several problems with his story that immediately raised red flags based on my understanding of his travel patterns and professional obligations. First, Daniel typically drove to client meetings the morning of his appointments rather than traveling the day before, because staying in hotels was an unnecessary expense that he avoided whenever possible given his financial situation. Second, Miles City was not in Daniel's regular territory, and advanced medical technologies had very few clients in that area because the market was too small to justify regular sales coverage. Third, Daniel's suggestion that we could have lunch at that little cafe I used to like was particularly suspicious because I had never taken Daniel to any cafe in Miles City when he was a child. We had driven through the area occasionally, but we had never stopped for meals or recreational activities there. But the most telling aspect of Daniel's invitation was his tone and timing. The artificial enthusiasm in the Sunday morning call suggested that this was a planned deception rather than a spontaneous idea, and the inconsistencies in his story indicated that he was lying about his reasons for wanting me to accompany him. My professional instincts were screaming that this was some kind of setup, but I needed to understand what Daniel was actually planning before I could determine how to respond. The best way to gather that information was to accept his invitation and document whatever happened next. That sounds wonderful, Daniel, I said, maintaining the tone of a pleased elderly mother who was grateful for her son's attention. What time would you like to leave? How about if I pick you up around 11, Daniel suggested. That way we can take our time, enjoy the drive, maybe stop at a few places along the way. The suggestion that we might stop at a few places was another red flag, because Daniel normally tried to minimize travel time and had never expressed interest in leisurely drives or tourist activities during our previous interactions. After ending the call, I immediately began preparing for what I suspected might be a dangerous situation. Using secure communication methods that Daniel couldn't monitor, I contacted Detective Sarah Williams of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division to inform her about Daniel's suspicious invitation and request that surveillance teams be prepared to track our movements throughout the day. I also activated the GPS tracking devices that I had hidden in my purse and clothing, ensuring that my location would be monitored continuously, regardless of what Daniel might be planning. Most importantly, I equipped myself with recording devices that would capture everything Daniel said and did during our trip, providing evidence that could be used for criminal prosecution if his actions constituted illegal behavior. At exactly 11 o'clock, Daniel arrived at my house driving his BMW X5, dressed in casual clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to project an image of a caring son taking his elderly mother on a pleasant Sunday outing. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel said with exaggerated enthusiasm as I opened the front door. "Are you ready for our adventure?" The word adventure was particularly ominous given Daniel's normal vocabulary and attitude toward spending time with me. He typically framed our interactions as obligations or favors rather than positive experiences, so his sudden enthusiasm was clearly performative rather than genuine. As we drove east on Interstate 94 toward Miles City, Daniel maintained cheerful conversation that seemed designed to keep me distracted from our route and destination. He talked about his work, asked questions about my daily activities, and made observations about the scenery that were completely unlike his normal communication patterns. But I was using my decades of investigative experience to analyze everything Daniel said and did, looking for clues about his real intentions, and preparing for whatever crisis or confrontation might be developing. About 40 minutes into our drive, Daniel took an exit that led away from the main highway toward a more remote rural area. When I asked about the detour, Daniel explained that he wanted to show me, quote, a beautiful scenic area that he had discovered during his travels. This explanation made no sense because Daniel had never expressed interest in scenery or natural beauty, and the road we were taking led away from Miles City rather than toward it. But I continued to play the role of the trusting elderly mother while documenting everything that was happening. The road Daniel had chosen led through increasingly remote countryside with fewer houses, less traffic, and minimal cell phone coverage. After another 20 minutes of driving, Daniel pulled into a small gas station that appeared to be the only business for miles in any direction. The gas station was a rundown facility called Prairie Stop that consisted of 2 old-fashioned gas pumps, a small convenience store, and a repair bay that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no other customers visible, and the entire area felt isolated and abandoned. "I need to get some gas and use the restroom," Daniel announced as he parked next to one of the pumps. "Do you want to go inside and get something to drink?" I agreed to go into the store while Daniel pumped gas, but I was immediately suspicious about why he had chosen this particular location when there had been several newer, more convenient gas stations along our route. Inside the convenience store, I spoke briefly with the elderly clerk, a man named Pete who seemed to be the only employee on duty. Pete was friendly and talkative, and I learned that the gas station had security cameras that recorded all activity in the parking area. "Don't get many folks out here on Sundays," Pete mentioned as I purchased a bottle of water. "Most people stick to the interstate unless they're local." This conversation confirmed that our location was unusually remote, and that Daniel had deliberately chosen an isolated area rather than simply stopping for gas during normal travel. When I returned to the parking area, Daniel was standing next to his BMW with the gas cap still open, apparently waiting for me to come outside. But his body language and facial expression had changed dramatically from the artificial cheerfulness he had maintained during our drive. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," Daniel said in a tone that was suddenly serious and coldly businesslike. I've been thinking about our situation, and I've decided that some changes need to be made. The phrase "our situation" was particularly ominous because it suggested that Daniel viewed our relationship as a problem that required resolution, rather than a family bond that deserved respect and nurturing. "What kind of changes?" I asked, continuing to record everything while preparing myself for whatever Daniel was about to reveal. "The truth is, Mom, I can't keep dealing with your constant needs and problems," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he used when talking about inconvenient business obligations. "Every time I turn around, you need help with something: transportation, technology, household issues. It's become a constant drain on my time and energy." Quote. This complaint was particularly insulting because my requests for assistance had been minimal and reasonable, and Daniel's characterization of normal family support as a constant drain revealed how completely his priorities had shifted away from basic human decency. "I understand that you need help sometimes," Daniel continued, "but I've realized that I'm not the right person to provide that help. You need to start making arrangements for the kind of ongoing support that I can't give you." The clinical language Daniel was using, making arrangements and ongoing support, sounded like he was discussing a business problem rather than talking to his mother about family relationships. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what Daniel had planned for this remote location. "I'm suggesting that you figure out how to manage your problems without constantly relying on me to solve them," Daniel replied, "starting today, right now." With that statement, Daniel walked back to his car, opened the driver's door, and looked at me with an expression that was completely devoid of love, guilt, or basic human compassion. "Daniel, what are you doing?" I asked, though the answer was becoming horrifyingly clear. "I'm going to Miles City for my meeting," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "You can call someone to pick you up, or figure out some other way to get home. I'm done being your personal chauffeur and problem solver." And with that declaration, Daniel got into his BMW, started the engine, and drove away without looking back, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot of a remote gas station in rural Montana. The act itself was stunning in its cruelty and calculation. Daniel had deliberately driven me to an isolated location where I would have difficulty getting help, and he had abandoned me there as a way of demonstrating that he considered our relationship terminated and my welfare irrelevant to his future plans. But what Daniel didn't know was that his act of abandonment had just triggered a series of consequences that would destroy his life more completely than he could possibly imagine. Within minutes of Daniel's departure, I was on my encrypted satellite phone contacting Detective Williams and providing her with my exact location, Daniel's license plate number, and a complete description of what had just occurred. "Catherine, we've been tracking your location through the GPS devices, and we have everything on audio from your recording equipment," Detective Williams confirmed. "Daniel has just committed felony elder abandonment under Montana state law, and because he transported you across county lines with the intent to abandon you, we can also pursue federal charges." The gas station's security cameras had recorded Daniel's license plate, the time of his arrival and departure, and the entire sequence of events that constituted his criminal abandonment of me. This video evidence would make his crime legally indefensible and ensure that he faced maximum penalties for his actions. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of Daniel's problems. While he was driving toward Miles City, believing that he had successfully rid himself of family obligations, I was implementing a comprehensive plan that would expose every aspect of his fraudulent lifestyle and ensure that he lost everything he had worked to build. Using my digital forensics expertise and the investigative resources I had prepared for exactly this situation, I began building a case that would reveal Daniel's criminal behavior, financial fraud, and professional misconduct to law enforcement, his employer, and his professional network. The first step was to analyze Daniel's credit card transactions, travel records, and expense account submissions to document the pattern of financial fraud that I had been monitoring for the past 2 years. Daniel had been charging personal expenses to his business account, inflating his travel costs to pocket the difference, and claiming business meals for personal dining that constituted theft from his employer. The total amount of Daniel's fraudulent expense account submissions was over $48,000 during the past 18 months, far more than the misdemeanor theft that he probably assumed it represented. At this level, Daniel's fraud constituted felony embezzlement that would result in serious criminal charges and immediate termination from his job. But the expense account fraud was just one component of Daniel's criminal activity. My analysis of his financial records revealed that he had also been engaged in tax evasion, credit card fraud, and identity theft that provided additional grounds for federal prosecution. Daniel had been claiming business deductions for personal expenses, failing to report consulting income that he had earned outside of his primary job, and using my personal information to open credit accounts that he used for his own purchases while allowing the bills to be sent to my address. Each of these activities constituted serious crimes that would result in substantial prison sentences and financial penalties. But more importantly, Daniel's pattern of financial fraud revealed exactly the kind of escalating criminal behavior that often preceded more serious crimes against family members. While Daniel was driving toward his fake business meeting, federal agents were already preparing arrest warrants and coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure that he would be taken into custody before he could return home or attempt to leave the state. The investigation I had been conducting for the past 2 years provided law enforcement with comprehensive evidence of Daniel's financial crimes, professional misconduct, and pattern of family exploitation that would support maximum criminal charges and ensure that his prosecution received priority attention from federal prosecutors. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Daniel's impending arrest was that it would occur in public, in front of the business associates and professional contacts whose respect and admiration Daniel valued more than the family relationships he had destroyed. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours after Daniel had abandoned me at the gas station, federal agents arrested him in the parking lot of the hotel in Miles City, where he was supposedly preparing for his client meeting. The arrest was conducted in full view of other hotel guests and staff, ensuring that Daniel's criminal behavior would be witnessed by strangers who would remember him as the man who abandoned his elderly mother and was arrested for fraud and elder abuse. The charges against Daniel included felony elder abandonment, federal fraud conspiracy, tax evasion, identity theft, and embezzlement, crimes that carried combined sentences of up to 25 years in federal prison. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of Daniel's downfall. His arrest triggered immediate investigation by his employer, which resulted in his termination and referral for criminal prosecution of his expense account fraud. The professional licenses and certifications that Daniel needed for his sales career were suspended pending resolution of his criminal cases. Most devastatingly, the publicity surrounding Daniel's arrest destroyed his carefully constructed professional reputation and social standing. Local news media covered the story extensively, focusing on the shocking details of a successful businessman who had abandoned his elderly mother at a remote gas station and been arrested for multiple financial crimes. The story resonated with audiences because it represented every family's worst nightmare about ungrateful children who exploit and abandon the parents who had sacrificed everything to give them opportunities. Daniel became a symbol of moral decay and family betrayal that generated widespread public condemnation and disgust. His expensive apartment, luxury car, and designer lifestyle were all revealed to be financed through fraud and debt rather than legitimate success. His professional accomplishments were exposed as exaggerated claims that had been used to manipulate clients and justify criminal behavior. But perhaps the most personally devastating consequence for Daniel was the complete destruction of his self-image as a successful, sophisticated professional who had earned his comfortable lifestyle through intelligence and hard work. The investigation revealed that Daniel's apparent success was entirely dependent on criminal activity and family exploitation. Without fraud and theft, he would never have been able to maintain the lifestyle that had become central to his identity and self-worth. Daniel's trial became a comprehensive demonstration of how completely he had misjudged the woman he chose to abandon. The evidence against him was so overwhelming and well documented that his attorney advised him to plead guilty to all charges, rather than risk even harsher sentences that would result from a trial. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement that detailed the 37 years of sacrifice and support that Daniel had rejected when he drove away from that gas station. "Your Honor," I said, addressing the federal judge who would determine Daniel's punishment, "the defendant didn't just abandon an elderly woman at a remote gas station. He abandoned the person who had given him every opportunity, every advantage, and every form of support that made his life possible. He chose his convenience over the love of the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to ensure his success. The judge's response was swift and decisive. Daniel was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for the elder abandonment and fraud charges, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which he would be required to pay full restitution for his crimes and participate in counseling programs designed to address his character disorders. The financial restitution alone would consume any income Daniel might earn for decades after his release, ensuring that he would never again be able to afford the luxury lifestyle that had been more important to him than family relationships. But the most fitting aspect of Daniel's punishment was that he would serve his sentence in a federal facility, where he would be surrounded by other criminals who had destroyed their lives through greed, selfishness, and fundamental failures of character. Daniel would have 8 years to think about the choices that had led him from successful professional to convicted felon, and to understand exactly what he had lost when he drove away from that gas station without looking back. Today, 3 years after Daniel's conviction, I continue to live independently in my own home, running my consulting business and overseeing a charitable foundation that I established to help elderly victims of family exploitation. The foundation provides legal assistance, investigation services, and financial support for elderly people who have been abandoned, exploited, or abused by family members who forgot that love and respect are not optional components of family relationships. Daniel remains in federal prison, where, according to reports from his case managers, he spends most of his time in the library reading books about family relationships and personal responsibility, subjects that he apparently never studied when such knowledge might have prevented his crimes. I receive occasional letters from Daniel expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness, but I do not respond to these communications. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, and abandoning your elderly mother at a remote gas station is certainly one of them. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that family relationships do not automatically create immunity from consequences when someone chooses to commit serious crimes. When Daniel abandoned me at that gas station, he transformed our relationship from mother and son to victim and perpetrator, which meant that all of my professional capabilities could be applied without the emotional limitations that had previously protected him. Daniel learned, too late, that underestimating someone based on age and family relationships can be a devastating mistake. He thought he was abandoning a helpless elderly woman who would probably find her way home and eventually forgive his cruelty. Instead, he provided someone with 35 years of digital forensics experience, with the motivation and justification needed to ensure that he faced maximum consequences for his crimes. The gas station where Daniel left me is still operating, and Pete, the elderly clerk, still remembers the day when a successful businessman abandoned his mother and drove away thinking he had solved his problems. Pete tells the story to customers sometimes, as a reminder that treating family members with cruelty and disrespect can result in consequences that last far longer than anyone imagines. And me? I'm living exactly the life I deserve. Free, independent, secure, and surrounded by people who understand that true wealth isn't money or professional success. It's integrity, gratitude, and the knowledge that you've used your life to make the world a little better than you found it. That's a legacy worth building, and it's a legacy that no one can ever steal from you, no matter how hard they try. The woman Daniel thought he could abandon has become a symbol of what happens when someone fundamentally underestimates their victim and discovers that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. And Daniel? He's exactly where he chose to be, facing the consequences of betraying someone who had given him everything and learning that some mistakes cost more than you can ever afford to pay. That remote gas station in rural Montana wasn't just the location of Daniel's worst moral failure, it was the starting point for a lesson in justice that he'll remember for the rest of his life. And every day for the next 5 years, when Daniel wakes up in his federal prison cell, he'll have the opportunity to think about what his life might have been like if he had simply treated his mother with the basic respect and consideration that every human being deserves. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it's usually more complete than the criminals expect. Daniel discovered that truth the hard way. And now the world knows exactly what happens when someone chooses cruelty over compassion and discovers too late that they've picked the wrong person to betray. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.